Welcome back to the series Philosophy for Living. This course is called The Examined Life, and its focus is on helping you to become more self aware and to understand the insights that philosophy and psychology can give you in terms of your own personal development. This course is concerned with how we use our mind, how we reflect on things. We know from our first lecture that the challenge is there to us to look at the influences that have been brought to bear in our lives, to consider what Plato and Socrates have offered us. We've also met Baudrillard and we've met Michel Foucault in terms of understanding how we know what we know and how that develops. So to take the next step, we need to move on and consider what we need in terms of how to do the work of deeper understanding, and the most important faculty that you have for that is the use of your mind, the capacity to think. And in this lecture we're going to meet one of the great founding fathers of philosophy, Immanuel Kant. We'll also meet some others along the way. We've met Heidegger. We will meet Hannah Arendt, whose work in terms of totalitarianism and evil is monumental, particularly in the world we're living in today, is hugely relevant. But we won't be delving too deeply into the political side of her philosophy, but certainly we will be examining her work in terms of what she considers it means to think. Now, at this outset of this course, I stated that there would be some things maybe that I would be critical of, because it's a little bit like physical health. If you go to a coach, a health coach, or even a medical coach or a medical practitioner, and you ask them about how to be healthier, they'll probably tell you to do two different categories of things. One, certain things you should be doing, like maybe you should be having a bit more exercise, maybe your diet could do with a little bit more fiber, maybe some vitamin supplements, maybe your sleep needs to improve. They're the things on the positive. And then on the negative, they maybe say there's certain things you probably shouldn't be doing. Maybe you shouldn't be smoking. Well, they wouldn't say maybe, they say don't smoke. Maybe don't drink too much alcohol. Maybe not to eat so many McDonald's fast food stuff. So they probably give you advice about that, because they say that your health is a balance between not doing things that injure it and doing things that actually promote it. But it's very there's a parallel there with your personal development, with your quality of life, with living your best life, which is what this course is helping you to do. And that means there'd be some things I would be suggesting that you stop doing or that you avoid doing. And I'm going to talk about one now. And this may be upsetting for some people because they may have spent a lot of time and effort and energy taking on a particular ideology about thinking or about how our minds work. And that they may have learnt along the way, they may have read some things, or they may have gone to some workshops, or they've done something like that in the body, mind, spirit genre, which, with the best intentions, some people will have actually said, this is really good for your personal development. And the one I'm going to discuss now briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's very important that I do say this, and that is because it's extremely popular and because a lot of people are influenced by that. It's an ideology. An ideology is a system of beliefs, a coherent set of beliefs about life and about change and about what makes the world go around that influence how we behave. So, for example, most religious beliefs are forms of ideology, but there are many, many political ideologies as well. We will be doing a separate course on which will deal in much more depth with the issue of ideology and where it fits in our lives and in our work, because most human beings, in fact, every human being, carries some kind of an ideological frame for how their life is and what it should be. So there is an ideology out there which is in the self-help genre, which suggests that thinking has a particular kind of power, the power of thought, And you'll find it probably best expressed in, we'll say, a book, the multi-million seller book, and all the ones that followed. Rhonda Byrne's, the journalist who wrote this book called The Secret. And in that book, there are some issues raised in relation to, that this is old, ancient wisdom. And of course, there's a kind of an attraction to that. We have, in the modern world, full of technology and full of everything is going so quickly, and it's all hard science, it's all technological, it's all digital stuff and all that stuff. There's a lovely kind of romantic feeling about if something is ancient. Now, some of the greatest diseases that killed lots of mankind are ancient as well, but they're usually not actually talked about. The notion that something is good because it's ancient is actually very flawed thinking, so we've got to be careful about that. Just because something is old doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean it's bad either. You've got to evaluate it on some other standard rather than whether it's old or not. So this old ancient wisdom, anyway, it's called ancient wisdom, and two particular forms it takes is one called a law of attraction, which is the idea that by virtue of your thinking, you actually affect the physical universe. And not only that, but that you attract things because of the way you're thinking. And the second aspect of this, the flip side of that coin, is the notion of that you're manifesting your reality. Now, both of these ideas are grounded in a particularly crazy understanding of how thinking works. But that being what it is, it sold millions because it's extremely attractive. And I want to talk a little bit about how dangerous that is, because if you want to pursue the journey of enlightenment, which is what we discussed in our last session, and which we'll go into in much more detail here, what is enlightenment, then you've got to actually leave that kind of thinking behind you because it's bad for you. But I want to give you some examples of how this works so you can understand this idea that by virtue of your thinking, you're shaping and you're changing reality. Now, it's very important here that this does not mean that your thinking doesn't affect how you are. Of course it does. I mean, probably the whole ground or basis for cognitive behavior therapy, which is the kind of sexy therapy of the moment. It's the one that's, basically shown to have actually quite a lot of good results for a lot of people, maybe better than certain other therapies that are available. Cognitive behavior therapy has got to do with how we think and how it affects our behavior. This is not what this means. This is a different form of thinking altogether. This is the idea that out of some kind of pseudo-scientific idea about magnetic fields and energy transfer, that your thinking is creating some kind of energetic message that's sending magnetic fields, energy fields into the environment, which is then changing the physical reality of the environment. Now, there's no ground at all to believe that this is true, but that doesn't stop people believing it. Of course, we all know that as human beings, we're very frail creatures and we're inclined to believe some crazy things. Well, this is a very crazy thing. So let's take an example of this. One of the things that you think about if you want to look at your personal development, for some people would be that they'd like to lose a bit of weight. Now, I'd like to lose a bit of weight as well. And I struggle a bit with that because I also like certain foods and I like food. So it's a struggle. Well, thankfully, because of the law of manifesting reality by our thinking, I don't have to worry too much about this anymore because I just need to change my thinking. So let's look at what Rhonda Byrne has to say about this. The most common thought that people hold, and I held it too, is that food was responsible for my weight gain. That is a belief that does not serve you. And in my mind is now complete balderdash. Food is not responsible for putting on weight. It is your thought that food is responsible for putting on weight that actually has food put on weight. Remember, thoughts are primary cause of everything. And the rest is effects from those thoughts. Think perfect thoughts, and the result must be perfect weight. Let go all those limiting thoughts. Food cannot cause you to put on weight unless you think it can. Isn't that wonderful? That is great news. Food cannot cause you to put on weight unless you think it can. So this is quite pernicious, because what it's actually saying to somebody who actually needs to lose weight is they really don't need to consider the issue of what it is they're eating. It's delusional, but it's also time wasting. And, if somebody's health is at stake, that's kind of dangerous. And let's take it another step and say, right, let's imagine that they're actually getting ill. Okay, so what does it have to say? What does this type of ideology say? Because again, this lecture is about thinking, so I gotta actually address something that says that there's a certain form of thinking that can help you, when in fact it won't at all. What about illness and disease? Okay, here's the solution. This is what this ideology tells us about the relationship between our thinking and disease. This is a quotation: our physiology creates disease to give us feedback, to let us know that we have an imbalanced perspective, or we are not being loving or grateful. And to continue, quote, when a person has manifested a disease in the body temple or some kind of discomfort in their life, can it be turned around through the power of right thinking? Absolutely yes. Okay, the first thing you'll notice about this is that the disease is supposed to be telling you something, that you're manifesting it in some way. And that means, in essence, that you're actually responsible for causing your illness. Now, this is dark, really, when you think about it. It's dark stuff. If you have a child, for example, who gets leukemia, how do you square that? How do you even consider that as being something that the child has manifested as a result of some kind of wrong thinking? Maybe they weren't loving or grateful. I mean, this is a type of cruelty when you think it through. And again, when we look at thinking, we're going to look at thinking things true, because this philosophy has taken a hold of a lot of people's lives. And this theme abounds in this self-help genre. And I'm often wondering about this when I look at this. I think about, what about all the years and all of the centuries of science and work, and people dedicating their whole lives to actually understanding illness and how the body works and how bacteria work and how immunology works and all the rest of that? Does your thinking make you ill? This is what they're saying, is that you're responsible for what happens to you. And if we go along then and we look at something like a virus, a pandemic, which now when Rhonda Byrne was writing this, the pandemic hadn't hit, but the AIDS epidemic had. So she says, you cannot catch anything unless you think you can. And thinking you can is inviting it to you with your thoughts. Now again, think about this in relation to the power that this gives thinking. It's not just that it influences you, or maybe if you think that this is the way to go to the Tesco store down the road, but you're actually wrong. If you think about it, you may take the wrong direction. This is not what she's talking about here at all. She's saying essentially that your capacity to be susceptible to a virus is completely in the will of your thinking. You cannot catch anything unless you think you can, and thinking you can is inviting it to you with your thoughts. So the virus, which is in the air, if you're thinking, I won't get COVID-19, then you won't get it. So you have to, and then she goes on and says, you don't have to fight to get rid of disease. Just the simple process of letting go of negative thoughts will allow your natural state of health to emerge within you, and your body will heal itself. Now, I've just given two examples here. That's the weight loss and health issues. But this kind of thinking is involved in nearly every aspect of life. You can apply this philosophy of thinking. One of the contributors talks about the idea that he got wealthy because he started to think that his bills were checks, and that this changed his life completely. Now, I've done a bit of research on that, and I have grave difficulty with discovering how he actually became wealthy. But I don't need to deal with that right now. I just need to tell you that this is applied in everything you're doing. So if you have actually captured that, if you have thought that this is a useful model to help you in your personal development and in your life, you're going to need to make a decision about this, because I think that this is a very dangerous and pernicious and corrupt uh, aspect. It's corrupting the capacity to think, because it's giving the capacity to think something that doesn't have. Not only that, but it's actually it allows you to actually daydream and to have a fantasy. Now, there is a period of a child in childhood. Psychologists recognize this for many, many decades, which is that it's called a magical thinking period. And it can be very traumatic for children, because as they grow to figure out their own autonomy, as they grow to figure out how things work and how much influence they have over their lives or not, they go through a period of time called magical thinking. And in that period of time, they think that if they do something or if they think something, it'll actually happen. So this is very difficult for them, because of course if they get cross about something, if they get angry with dad or angry with mom or angry with their older brother, and they kind of think, I just wish they were dead or something like that, that angry, you could just go into a kind of a, mean any of it. But if you had a magical thinking thing going on, then you think, oh my God, what am I going to do? Maybe mom will die, maybe dad will die. Freud is very useful in terms of actually understanding how this period of time works and what happens to the child as they try to integrate their anger differently. But if they get stuck into that period of time, or they get caught up in during their adulthood, into a period of time thinking that thinking makes it so, they may be suffering from a quite debilitating disorder called obsessive compulsive disorder. People who you see walking on cracks, walking, tapping their wrist 3 times or whatever. These are little rituals they may have developed because they've had a thought, they've had a negative thought, they've had a destructive thought for which they blame themselves. It's a deeply, deeply worrying condition for people who have it, because they don't realize that this is an anxiety disorder that they can get help with, and they won't tell anybody about it because they can't believe they're thinking these terrible things. So if you suffer from any of that, please let me reassure you that this has got nothing to do with your morality, and it affects the most sensitive people in the world. So for example, a religious person like a priest might have one of these thoughts, but the thought will always be something to do with the things that they hold most dear. Like spitting into the chalice. Horrendous. Whereas there'd be somebody who doesn't care about chalices at all, that wouldn't bother them at all. The most faithful husband or wife might have a thought about being unfaithful. And then they can't believe that, because it's the very thing that they hold most precious that's usually attacked by one of these thoughts. Anyway, I won't go into that in too much detail, but my point is that there's a condition called magical thinking in childhood and obsessive compulsive disorder in adulthood, which is the idea that thinking makes it so. And this pseudo-spiritual thing has kind of it doesn't acknowledge that could be what's going on. It dresses it up rather in some kind of old ancient wisdom. It is a bit ancient, I think. I'm sure somebody thought about it way back in the day, but it's not wise, and it's got nothing to do with wisdom. So please, if that's something that you are investing in and considering to be valid as a way or as a form of living an enlightened life, it isn't. Okay, well then, what is our thinking then? If that's not what our thinking is, well, what is it? Well, I want to introduce you to Immanuel Kant. And in our last lecture, we looked at the allegory of the cave. And in this lecture, I'm going to use an essay by Kant, which is very, very helpful. It's called, What is Enlightenment? Remember that when the prisoner left the cave in our first lecture, we talked about moving towards the light, towards truth, towards understanding nature, understanding how the world works, leaving a lot of the influence that have shaped their lives. Immanuel Kant wrote this essay in 1760 something, as far as I know. Don't have the date specifically here, but he was leading the charge in the period of time that became called the Enlightenment, which was the enormous development in human history in terms of how science and reason and understanding began to break through an enormous sort of progress, changing the world. The world we live in now, most of what we experience in the West in particular, for good and for ill, is a product of the Enlightenment. And we're living in strange times because there is an effort being made out there to actually dismantle the wonders that the Enlightenment brought us, by people who actually seem to be cutting off the branch they're sitting on. The idea that there are facts, for example, that's something that is actually being, the idea of truth and knowledge, or that we can pursue knowledge, these things are being undermined as we go. However, I'm going to stay with Kant for the moment, and he says, to quote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage," N-O-N-A-G-E. Now, nonage, if you're familiar with the phrase dotage, it's more commonly used. Oh, they're in their dotage when old people are kind of senile and losing the plot. Nonage is the early form. It's nonage is the immaturity, the undeveloped mind, the immature person. So he says, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage. Knowledge is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This knowledge is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Then he says, dare to know. Let's challenge you, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. So here we have Kant saying to you, dare to use your own reason. Learn how to think. Get out from your immaturity, from where you let other people decide. Now he asks the question, well, why do people avoid this? He says, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives, long after nature has freed them from external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. This is interesting. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet and so on, then I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think. If only I can pay, others will take care of that disagreeable business for me. So here we have Kant actually telling us that, the easy way is to not think for yourself, to not seek your own understanding, but to actually allow someone else, to allow authority to tell you how to live your life. Now, of course, here we are seeing a parallel with Plato. We'll go back to our conversation in the last lecture, and we look at the puppet masters that Plato's talked about. And you'll have done a little bit of work with your handbook. You'll have started to think about this. So he says, those guardians who have kindly taken supervision upon themselves see to it that the overwhelming majority of mankind, and then of course he's very misogynistic here, he says, among them the entire fair sex, should consider the step to maturity not only as hard, but as extremely dangerous. So he's naming what Plato also said. It's difficult and it can be dangerous to actually step out from underneath the guardianship. First, these guardians make their domestic cattle stupid and carefully prevent the docile creature from taking a single step without the leading strings to which they have fastened them. He's making the comparison here between the herd, between the docile animal who will go wherever it's led and the human being. Then they show them the danger that would threaten them if they should try to walk by themselves. Now this danger is really not very great. After stumbling a few times, they would at last learn to walk. However, examples of such failures intimidate and generally discourage all further attempts. Thus, it is very difficult for the individual to work himself out of his non-age or his immaturity, which has become almost second nature to him. And this idea of second nature comes from Aristotle. The idea that if you're doing something long enough or often enough, it actually feels that it's natural thing to do. It becomes part of your way of being in the world. Back to Heidegger's notion of being in the world. How do we define how to be in the world? So we are creatures of habit, and gradually it just becomes normal or normative for us to behave in a certain way. So what Kant is saying here is that becoming a non-thinker, somebody who just follows the rules, becomes second nature to most people. He has even grown to like it, and is at first really incapable of using his own understanding because he's never been permitted to try it. Dogmas and formulas, these mechanical tools designed for reasonable use, or rather abuse, of his natural gifts, are the fetters of an everlasting knowledge. Look at what he's saying here again. He's saying the fetters of everlasting immaturity. Where did we see fetters before? We saw it in the chains. In Plato's chains, we saw it in Rousseau's concept of the chain, Marx's concept of the chain. So here we are chained into our immaturity. The man who casts them off would make an uncertain leap over the narrowest ditch because he is not used to such free movement. That is why there are only a few men who walk firmly and who have emerged from knowledge by cultivating their own minds. So what Kant would do here now, Kant would congratulate you for doing this course, because what he would be saying to you is, well done, you actually are embracing the task of cultivating your own mind. I'm going to congratulate you too, because I think it's a wonderful thing to do. So Kant is anxious to encourage you and encourage people to dare to use their own understanding, to dare to use their own reason. And he says, once such men have thrown off the yoke of knowledge, they will spread about them the spirit of a reasonable appreciation of man's value and of his duty to think for himself. So your duty to think for yourself. A man may postpone his own enlightenment, but only for a limited period of time. And to give up enlightenment altogether, either for oneself or one's descendants. Now that's interesting. He brings in our children into this. If you have children, is to violate and to trample upon the sacred rights of man. End quote. So Kant is telling us that this is a great challenge, to use our own understanding. And not only for ourselves, but it's a sacred right that we have. Now this was new, because when Kant was writing this, the beginning of the period of the Enlightenment, there was always that, and the whole period of Enlightenment began to open up, historically, a conflict between the rights of the individual and the rights of the collective. And the notion of the self, which is in our next lecture, was such a new concept that the idea of the individual having their own understanding was quite revolutionary, because the task of the individual was not so much to develop their own understanding, their own thinking. No, it was to be part of the tribe, part of the collective, part of the group, to identify within the group so that the group would survive. And historically, from 100,000 years since we left the savannah, hunter-gatherers, groups, we needed to work together as a collective. We developed language. When Homo sapiens developed language, they were able to outpace the other hominoids because they were able to communicate better with each other. So these two faculties, their capacity to think and their capacity to speak with each other, but this was always as part of the collective. And there are ideologies today that suggest that that's how it should be. And there's always that tension between the individual and the collective. Ideologies that support the notion that the collective must be primary will always end up persecuting the individual, because the human individual has no importance. This is why communism, when you look at communism, which is essentially the prizing of the collective, always above the individual, will always seek to repress and dampen anybody from having creative thinking using their own reason. It's authoritarian, it becomes totalitarian. This is for another conversation, but it's important to name that. It's important to historically place what Kant is saying. So the development of the individual became an extraordinarily important part of modern Western thinking, and it has gone on for hundreds of years. But Kant was the one who, more than anybody, called it out. Okay, so what do we do then? What do we need to do? If we say, right, Kant is saying dare to use your own reason, what does that actually mean? Ayn Rand is a social theorist who wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. She was an emigre from Russia and was, I would say, probably one of the most virulent critics of communism, and a great advocate for private property, laissez-faire capitalism, and drive some people crazy because she was so vociferous in her belief that laissez-faire capitalism is actually the way to go. It's called libertarianism. She developed a school of thought called objectivism, which is a very sort of strong radical notion of objective truth and our capacity to identify it. She says something about thinking that I think is very useful. There's a lot about Ayn Rand I don't like, by the way. But she said this, and she coined a phrase that I thought was very helpful. She said, to think is an act of choice. Now, here's an interesting one to start off with. To think is an act of choice. The key to human nature is the fact that a person is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The functions of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The functions of your mind is not. Very powerful statement. The function of your mind is not automatic. There's no fully determined program that's working in your mind. Now, there are people who disagree with this. I have to say that. There are people who are very strongly of the view that everything we think, that there is no freedom, everything we think is already built into the software. We're just basically like computers and we have no control over that. I don't believe that. That's for another conversation. But her notion of volitional consciousness, we are conscious, that's for sure. But the idea of a volitional, what we do with our consciousness, this is what thinking is about. So that's the first thing, that we have a faculty called thinking, which is volitional. Kant is telling us we need to use it. But what do we need to do? How does that work? Now, that's the next piece we need to look at. The next piece we need to look at is making a distinction between how this works, between two elements that go to make up thinking. One part is called instrumental thinking, and the other is called reflective thinking. Now, instrumental thinking is using your intellect, and Kant is the one who is credited with understanding the difference between intellect and reasoning. Intellect is a much more narrow form because it has to do with focusing on a very specific narrow form of how we use our minds. Using our minds in a very narrow form called instrumental thinking. So, instrumental thinking, if we think about using our mind as an instrument to solve a problem. And we can look at a philosopher called Ortega y Gasset. And he made a strong critique of the development of technology, because what he felt that industrialized the Industrial Revolution and the development of technology, and he'd also be following Heidegger on this, creates a way for human beings to use their minds that's at best incredibly narrow, but also quite dangerous. It fails to use the broad capacity for human reflection, because it takes their cognitive capacities and pours it into a very specialist area. So we've all these specialists. So he says that this form of, in work, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, in mechanics, in technology, the human being is kind of becoming constricted in their capacity. They use their intelligence for a very narrow form of function. And as a result of that, they get damaged by this. And society gets harmed by it. Because you've got all these people who are actually just becoming specialists. He says that this form of thinking creates an extraordinary, strange type of person. The investigator who has discovered a new fact of nature must necessarily experience a feeling of power and self-assurance. With a certain apparent justice, he will look upon himself as a person who knows. The specialist knows very well in his own tiny corner of the universe. He is radically ignorant of all the rest. We shall have to say that he is a learned ignoramus, which is a very serious matter, as it implies that he is a person who is ignorant, not in the fashion of an ignorant man, but with all the petulance of one who has learned in his own special line. And I think we've kind of all met people like that. People who have become specialists in a particular area, but seem extraordinarily ignorant in so many other aspects of life. One of these divisions that are sometimes made is the notion between general intelligence and emotional intelligence. Oftentimes when people are talking about emotional intelligence, they're describing people who understand things about life and about, who are able to read social signals, who are able to read how things are happening. Now that's not just emotion, that is actually intelligence. It's a broader form of thinking. That's what you expect from someone who's doing reflective thinking as distinct from instrumental thinking. Okay, so instrumental thinking is important. Like, if I am going to have brain surgery, I don't mind whether the guy that's actually doing it, or the lady who's doing the brain surgery, has become a learned ignoramus in the sense that their social awarenesses are not good or whatever. I don't mind if they've stayed up in their little laboratory their whole lives, as long as, because brain surgery is extremely technical and extremely specialized. So that's fine. So it has its place, of course. Of course it has its place. But what Kant is saying is that's not the big picture. We need to develop, and particularly if we're particularly sharp or bright or technically good at something, we can do that. But there's a whole vast arena of thinking that a lot of people stay away from. And they sometimes confuse the fact that they're specialized in an area with the notion that they're actually knowledgeable in others. And Ortega is saying, no, they're not. Not only that, but that the world we live in tends to prize the people who become these narrow-minded specialists and don't have a broader understanding, and that a lot of education leads people into that difficulty. So you can be highly intelligent and highly specialized and never really use your mind properly. A good example of this comes from the work of Hannah Arendt, and because she, more than anybody, took Kant's idea of thinking and developed it in terms of helping us understand what kind of habits we need to develop our thinking, which is what I want to share with you today. Now, why did she do this? She did this because she understood that the form of thinking called instrumental thinking was a very important part of how the Holocaust happened. That to turn a whole country, a whole nation of people, and a whole state into a machine of mass murder required that people stopped thinking broadly about what they were doing. And her biggest example of that was when she went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann. A useful film to go is the film Finale. It's the more recent film about what happened when Eichmann was kidnapped by the Mossad from Argentina, where he had been on the run for 10 years. He escaped from Germany eventually and got to Argentina with a lot of help from a lot of people, including the people in the church, who, to their eternal shame, promoted and helped the Nazis to escape to Argentina. But anyway, Eichmann ended up in Argentina, and if you're not familiar with Eichmann, Eichmann could be considered one of the most evil people that ever lived on the planet, because he orchestrated, arranged, systematically organized the deportation of over 1 million Jews to Auschwitz and to the other death camps. He was in charge, essentially, of the deportation programs during the Holocaust, and he did it very well. So, when Arendt went to his trial and began to listen to his testimony, she was struck by something, and this is quite a revolutionary about evil. And she said, when she saw him and listened to him, she said he was neither monstrous nor demonic. And the only specific characteristic one could detect in his past as well as in his behaviour during the trial and the preceding police examination was something entirely negative. It was not stupidity, but a curious, quite authentic inability to think. So, Arendt, when she followed it, began to look at it, she began to realise that there was a form of thinking, which we call instrumental thinking, which allowed Eichmann, who was intelligent, to do something extremely destructive and to continue doing it without ever really fully reflecting on what it was he was doing. And as a result of that, she coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She thought that our understanding of evil, of mass evil in particular, which focuses on the moral choices that we make, is inadequate. There's another form of evil doing, which is a form of evil that never gets into our moral centre at all, because we're just doing our job. We're just doing the task, and we're doing the task very well, but we're not considering what the implications of it are. So reflective thinking would mean that you'd reflect on the meaning of what it is you're doing. And as a result of that, she developed her thinking around this in terms of mass evil. I've written extensively on this in terms of understanding genocide in a different way. So Arendt, as a result of that, Arendt then gives us something to help us to understand, well, what is thinking? What is the kind of thinking that prevents us from that type of thoughtless banality? So her first conversation, she goes back to Socrates. Now, we've met Socrates already, and what she has to say about Socrates is, she says that Socrates helps us to understand thinking in terms of what's called an inner dialogue. Now, what does that mean? Well, she gives an example of a conversation Socrates has with one of his interlocutors, Hippias. Because remember, we talked about the fact that when Plato was writing about Socrates, there's a form of conversation, a dialogue that's used as a forum or a platform to develop the ideas. Socrates says, "It would be better for me that my lyre," or lyre's their musical instrument, "or chorus should be out of tune and loud with discord, and that multitudes of men should disagree with me, rather than that I, being one, should be out of harmony with myself and contradict me." So Socrates is recognizing something, and Arendt is picking up, self-contradiction is a feature. Thinking means beginning to examine your conscience in terms of areas where you're contradicting yourself. So this Socratic proposition that suggests that being in harmony with oneself requires an internal resolution. So he continues the dialogue. He says to Hippias that when he goes home, Socrates goes home, he will be met by someone who always cross-examines him. Hippias, it appears, is particularly empty-headed, and Socrates tells him how blissfully fortunate he is not to have to go through such an examination. So he says to Hippias, "You don't have to do this. You go home, you're blissfully ignorant. I go home, I have someone who questions me, myself. I have an internal dialogue." Now, we've all met people like Hippias. I heard a lovely story that people, and sometimes it can be like Socrates, isn't it great? Because I've thought about this sometimes, you meet people and you know that they've never had an original thought in their head. They seem not to be interested in thinking. Their life can go along quite okay. But I heard a good story about that once. I said, somebody was telling me this, there was this metaphor or picture of this, not a metaphor, but a picture that captures it. Policeman on the side of the road talking to a driver in a car, an old man sitting there behind the wheel, car in perfect condition, parked on the side of the road, huge pile up just behind him. And the policeman is interviewing him as a witness. He's saying to him, he talks to him a bit, and then the old man says to him, well, he says, he said, the interesting thing about all of this, he said, is I've never been in an accident, but I've seen an awful lot of them. So the policeman has actually already got all the details down, and he says, sir, I just need to tell you something. The reason why you're seeing so many of them is because you're causing them. And so when I think about hippies or people who never seem to think about things or think things through, they may be blissfully unaware, but there are casualties out there. And Kant would say a part of our casualties sometimes may be our children, our descendants. We don't help them to develop their minds. We don't help them to think, to reflect. So one of the categories then that Socrates offers us and that Arendt picks up on is the notion of the internal contradiction. The fact that we need to have to take stock, to look at areas where where our lyre is out of tune with ourselves. Are we contradicting ourselves? Are we holding contradictory views that we haven't resolved? Are we thinking about something and not giving it enough analysis to understand that's actually not in tune with who I want to be or how I want to do my life? A second quality or characteristics of the kind of thinking, reflective thinking, that Kant is telling us we should pursue if we want to consider being enlightened is resultlessness. This is the notion of thinking not simply pragmatically so we can get a result. Instrumental thinking is always results focused. It's always, how do I get from A to B to C? How do I make that happen? Sometimes thinking means, no, hold on a minute, I'm examining something. It doesn't have to come up. I don't have to fix it. I don't have to solve it. I need to reflect on it. I need to think about it. So Arendt goes back to Greek philosophy. She goes back to the Vale of Penelope, the story of Odysseus, the Odyssey, the great, wonderful Greek story, the myth. Because the Odysseus has to go on his Odyssey. That's where it comes from. And he's away on his Odyssey, as you are, if you're Odysseus. And Penelope, his wife, who is beautiful, has to await his return. And during that time, she's waiting for him to come back. Many suitors come to seek her hand in marriage because they believe he's not coming back. I need to get over it. I need to move on, as they say. So Penelope has a plan. She can't be rude. She can't be just tell him to go and take a hike. So what she says is, very diplomatic, she says, well, when I finish making the shroud, she's making a shroud for her father-in-law. When I'm finished making the shroud, I'll have it complete and then I'll become available for marriage. And I may give you my hand. I'll give you an answer at least. So they go away. So Penelope sews and embroiders all day long, and at night time she unravels it. And of course, because she unravels it, it's never complete. The raiment is never complete. So Arendt helps us to understand the idea of resultlessness as part of our reflective thinking, which is the idea of examining all our beliefs. And she says, thinking has a destructive undermining effect of all established criteria, values, measurements for good and evil, and in short, on those customs and rules of conduct we treat in morals and ethics. The temptation to replace old codes with new ones is overcome by the relentless destructive effects of thinking. She talks then about you're not focusing on the results here. You're doing the thinking because that's what you need to do, to unravel, to seek to dismantle what seems to be your sacred cows or your, whatever it is that you think you're sure of. And this, of course, is difficult. This is why Kant says it's difficult to do this. It takes guts. If you're lazy and cowardly, you're not going to do it. You're not going to take all that good stuff that you've been handed down year on, generation and generation, and actually sit back and say, hold on a minute here, I want to examine this. This does not mean you have to throw it out. It means you examine it to see what you will keep, to make it your own. So, for Arendt, thinking always unravels certainties, leading to new ideas and new challenges. She says, thinking is equally dangerous to all creeds and by itself does not bring forward any new creed. So by itself, thinking isn't going to bring through a new creed. It will dismantle an old one. So we can conclude that it will be so much easier for people not to undergo this kind of trauma. It's so much easier, you know. Rephrasing Hamlet, you could say a fundamental challenge is to think or not to think. That is the question. The third piece, so we've got the inner dialogue, we have the dismantling, and now we have detachment. This is the third element of thinking that she describes. She tells us that the act of thinking interrupts all doing. Thinking separates the thinker from their everyday engagement. So, for example, when you're having a conversation with somebody, you're actually not thinking about them. You're in the conversation. If you want to think about the person, you have got to do something. You know this yourself. You might have little things flitting in and out of your head, but if you're to actually think about the person you're talking to, somehow you've got to leave the conversation. You've got to step back out. And it's often after the conversation you do that reflection. You think, oh, you know, Joseph wasn't in great form today. You might have been picking up the things when you're in the conversation, but when you go back and think about it, you have to be more detached. So there's a, you know, we face a conundrum then when we have to step back from something. And our world is not encouraged that most of the time, particularly if we're working in a bureaucracy or whatever, like Eichmann. Eichmann's concern from the moment he woke up in the morning till he went to bed at night was, how can I get these trains moving faster? How do we get enough, the train drivers, you know, their hours, you know, their time, you know, whatever, their wages? What's my budget? I need to think about the budget for the train drivers. I need to think about the cost of the transportation of the Jews. Now, of course, they made many of them actually pay for their own transportation to the death camps. So there was a budget. Then there was all of this war machinery going on. There was trains coming with tanks and with artillery pieces to try to get to the Eastern Front because the Russians were beginning to win the war, and they were trying to get the trains up to get support of their soldiers. This was getting in the way of Eichmann's plan, so he was struggling with this and oftentimes insisted that a train full of soldiers and artillery pieces and supplies would have to wait, because the urgency was to get the Jews to their death in Auschwitz. Unbelievably evil. And yet, he was dedicated because he was moving the materials. And he was using his intellect to do that. Detachment steps back from the engagement in the task. Detachment for you step back from the engagement of the day-to-day ordinariness of life, which we all have to do. We've got to, you know, we can't be doing the thinking all of the time. That's the other piece. I like to think about this like if you ever see dolphins, they're swimming around doing dolphin kind of things. Now, because they have to come up for air. But I like this idea, like maybe that's a good metaphor for us coming up for thinking time to evaluate what it is we're doing. So the dolphin is doing his dolphin stuff, you're doing your human stuff, you're doing your day stuff, you're running, you're bringing your kids, if you have children, you're bringing your parents, if you have parents, whatever it is you're doing, you're going to work, you're trying to earn some money, you're trying to pay the bills, you're doing all this stuff. Do you take time to stop and do like a dolphin and come up for air? Do you take time to detach from the everydayness, the ordinary, everyday, habitual way your life is going, and reflect on what it is you're doing? So these are the qualities. So this is a bit like, you know, when you're driving a car, for example, you drive a car, initially you find it quite difficult to drive because you have to learn all the bits and pieces, and gradually it becomes a habit. So you no longer have to think about it. Well, our lives are a little bit like that. We have creatures of habit. But that's just a reality we're in, but we have the capacity to detach from it, and this is what part of reflective thinking allows us to do. It's the capacity to step back and understand. Like if we think about a fish in an aquarium, fish don't understand anything about aquariums. You know, they're swimming around in it. They don't know anything about plastic plants or glass or or pebbles on the ground, the different ones, the artificial. They don't. They're just swimming around in it. We're a bit like that. We're in an aquarium. We're in a cave. We've got a whole reality that we're immersed in. Like Heidegger says, we're immersed in being. But our capacity to think allows us to step back and detach and take time. And many people don't like to do that because they're scared of it. It's frightening. They're upset that maybe if they did that, they wouldn't like what they see. But if you want to be in charge of your life, if you want to pursue enlightenment and personal development, you've got to take stock of how you're doing, not what you're doing. Now, another part of that. So that's your mind is now working. These three things that we've talked about. We've talked about detachment. We've talked about the inner dialogue, being true to yourself. We've talked about sometimes just examining something without necessarily needing to fix it. What do you then focus your attention on? So this takes us to the task of self-education. Education comes from the Latin educare, to lead out, to lead ourselves out from what Kant calls our knowledge, what Arendt calls our thoughtlessness. So what do we focus on? Well, self-education allows us to learn, and the modern world has provided extraordinary levels of information for us to engage with. But again, a lot of traditional education doesn't foster the kind of thinking that we're talking about. It fosters instrumental thinking. It doesn't foster reflective thinking. One commenter, Paulo Freire, writes, when he talks about what goes for education in the modern world, he says it's a narration sickness. Narration, which is storytelling, with the teacher as the narrator, leads the student to memorize the narrated content. Worse still, it turns them into containers, into receptacles to be filled by the teacher. The more completely he fills the receptacle, the better the teacher he is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better the students they are. So this is the idea of the human being as a container to be filled with information, rather than a thinker to engage with the material. So you can educate yourself without having much formal education. That's my point. Self-education is learning, applying your thinking to new ideas, opening your mind to things, reading more. Now, reading, people listen to audiobooks, which are great. They look at podcasts, which are great. There's an enormous amount of amazing stuff out there. But reading, even if you're only to read 5 or 6 sentences a night to get into the habit of it, because reading uses a different faculty. It genuinely does use a different faculty, and it will enrich your mind if you can. So I'm going to recommend that you become more of a reader. So educating yourself as part of an examined life means resisting the tendency to accept many of the trite and trivial versions of the self-help industry in terms of personal development. It will also mean that you start to maybe look at more to do with the history of where you've come from, how you've become who you are today, what's in the cave. Our next lecture is going to look much more closely at that. But the most important part of it is that it's a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong task to continue to learn, and it can be incredibly fulfilling. Probably the best example I have of somebody who's a self-educated person is a man called Eric Hoffer. He worked as a longshoreman in the shipyards of San Francisco. He wrote 10 books. He had no formal education. He used to always try and get a place to live near the library. And he wrote a book called A True Believer, which is a story about how mass movements, how people can get corrupted by mass movements, how the person loses their identity. And it's probably one of the most important books on the power of ideology that's available today. Arthur Schlesinger described this book as a brilliant and original inquiry into the nature of mass movements. So you don't need to have a formal education to have a good mind, to to learn and have the joy of reflective thinking. And this is the main tool that you're going to need for the rest of this course, because now we can now use these things, and there's some exercises in your handbook to help you. So I'm going to say, like, what we need now, the reading material, I've given you some thought experiments to reflect on. And again, I'm going to recommend Barbara Ehrenreich's Smile or Die, How Positive Thinking Fooled America and the World, because I think it's an essential text. It's an easy read. It's a good story. It's an essential text in terms of helping you to avoid certain aspects of the delusional stuff out there that you've got to avoid. Okay, so our next challenge will be to look at what does it mean to become a person. How do we now evaluate using these faculties that we have, our cognitive faculties? Immanuel Kant helps us to challenge us to do. Where do we apply it now? So our next lecture is going to look at the birth of the self, the enlightenment, and how the individual became, and how the idea of us taking personal responsibility for life, how that developed, and what it means for you as you proceed in the course. So, until then, take care of yourself.